30 sharp. You're all very welcome this morning. My name is Caroline Kinsella. Thank you very much for joining us on behalf of myself and my colleagues at Smurfit Executive Development. We're delighted to be joined by our colleague this morning, Professor Patrick Gibbons. Pat is a Jefferson Smurfit Professor of Strategic Management. He's also our Academic Director at Smurfit Executive Development, so we work very closely with him. He plays a pivotal role in the design and delivery of customised and open programmes in our portfolio. He's currently a visiting professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and at ESMT in Berlin. He actively contributes to the UCD school programs in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Sri Lanka. His research and teaching and consulting interests are in the areas of strategic management, competitive intelligence, organizational change, international business, and leadership development. Prior educational qualifications are at UCD, and his PhD in strategic planning is with the University of Pittsburgh. Before entering academia, Pat worked in a number of financial and corporate roles with KPMG, the Jefferson Smurfit Group, and the Investment Bank of Ireland and An Post. So without eating into Pat's precious time this morning, we will invite you to ask questions throughout the session. We know it'll be very informative and very interesting, but we want to make it as interactive as possible. So please use the chat feature at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on the device that you're using. And we'll hand over to Pat and we'll take the questions towards the end. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks very much, Caroline. And thank everyone for joining this webinar. Delighted to see so many old friends joining us, and also delighted to see so many new faces joining us as well. So what I'd like to do over the next 40 minutes or 45 minutes or so to leave time for questions and some interaction is to think about strategy in turbulent times, and in a way to sort of explicate what we mean about strategy and what we mean by strategy. And I think a lot of questions are, well, is strategy still relevant in a situation like we're in at the moment? We're in a dramatic crisis. Surely, you know, we can park strategy in a way and think about how do we survive? How do we manage our operations in some sort of, you know, way that ensures survival? And so I want to tie those two issues together, because, you know, and you can read as easy as I can, but I'm always intrigued by this book and this quote from this book, which was written by a guy who writes for Fortune magazine. And he says, and you can read this as easy as I can, but towards the middle there, strategies come into dominance as the framework by which companies understand what they're doing and want to do. The construct or the idea through which and around which the rest of their efforts are organized. And then he goes on and says, this eclipses any other change worth in the intellectual landscape of business over the past 50 years. But what I want to hone in on is this notion of strategy as the framework by which companies understand what they're doing and want to do, and the construct through which and around which the rest of their efforts are organized. I just want to amplify that for a second. Okay, so strategy, the basic idea of strategy is this: to manage this tension, and the tension is between some aspiration, what is it we want to do, and some set of capabilities that we have. So we can see a tension between where you want to get to and where we are at the moment and the capabilities we have at the moment. And that tension is even more dramatically challenged by the fact that we have to manage that tension between what we want to do and the capabilities which we have currently. And we have to do that in the context of an environment that is risky, uncertain, and in some cases unknowable, which prevents us with dramatic challenges. So one of the things I was thinking about in preparing for this webinar was thinking back to some sort of themes that I think might be useful to think about as we move through this crisis, and thinking about our strategy in these turbulent times. And so I thought about what other turbulent times in history can we think about, and what sort of strategy lessons do we draw from them? And certainly, you know, in the last century, the period, let's say, between the late 20s and 1939, was certainly a turbulent period, certainly in European history. A lot of potential conflict, the rise of Germany, the sort of the reparations after the First World War, the rise of fascism in Europe. And, in these turbulent times, the French government and the French military made a significant decision. And the significant decision they made was to commit, and again, another notion of strategy, this commitment of resources. They decided to commit a significant amount of resources to national defense. And the way they did that was to build the Maginot Line, which, as you can see here, is a representation of it. And this this traversed the French countryside for hundreds of kilometers, and basically was a subterranean city and fortification with a series of forts linked to each other across a wide span of French territory. And this was designed to prevent German attack. And so a massive commitment to resources, as you can see, basically 6 levels underground with all sorts of, food, naturally, because it's the French army. I don't know, I can't see the wine cellar there, but I'm sure there was one. And naturally, hospital, subterranean railroad connection, and so on. And so this was a major commitment of resources in order to defend France. The problem was that the Maginot Line was designed and based on a premise, on an assumption. And that premise was that Germany might attack through on the land border with Germany. And of course, that didn't happen. So one of the things that is really critical in strategy and in thinking about strategy in turbulent times is to think about what are the assumptions that underlie our strategy? What are the key assumptions that underlie our strategy? What are the key assumptions you made about customers? What are the key assumptions you made about competitors? What are the key assumptions you made about technology? What are the key assumptions you made about the economy more broadly? And do those assumptions, are they still valid, or which ones have been challenged in these turbulent times? So, based on that experience, many people have asked me, so is the strategic plan that we've developed totally irrelevant? And in a way, I would say that irrespective of the situation we're in at the moment, perhaps all strategic plans are nearly as irrelevant after we've written them, because no plan survives contact with the enemy, as von Moltke the Elder, a Prussian general, once said. In other words, we seduce ourselves into thinking that we can plan, but we know that the plan will not be implemented as we expected. It won't be executed as we expected, because the world is changing around us, and the world is changing around us at a pace that perhaps is some aspects of it are knowable, but much of it is unknowable, and we will be surprised. So we have to acknowledge that no plan survives contact with the enemy, but why quote one general when you can quote another? And Eisenhower said that plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And I think the motivation for this is that he acknowledges von Moltke's statement that no plan survives contact with the enemy, but he goes a step further and he says, acknowledging that planning is everything, because it forces you to think through this tension between what do we aspire to, what are our current capabilities, and how might we bridge the gap between our aspiration and our current capabilities in the context of a changing environment. So the process of planning, the process of thinking through the strategy, forces us to be clear about what perhaps our aspirations are, what our capabilities are, and it forces us also to think about how we think the environment may change around us, acknowledging the fact that what we think now will be challenged by the outturn of events. Recently, I read Robert Iger's book and of the Walt Disney Company, and I was intrigued in certain sections because, again, he reinforces this tension, if you like, and he says, and I'm frequently asked this notion of cultural strategy, and does culture eat strategy for breakfast? And we may come back to that in a second, but again, you can read this as easily as I'll read it off. But it's this articulation of priorities so that we know what the priorities are. So this becomes important. And I think this again speaks to this notion of, are we clear of what our aspirations are? What are our priorities? What are our objectives? So in a way, being clear about this and being clear about what our aspirations are. That's just one aspect of strategy, but it's an important aspect because it helps us think through where we should focus our attention. And he moves on from that by saying, take the guesswork out of people's day-to-day lives. Provide the company and its senior team with a roadmap. This is where we want to be. This is how we're going to get there. And in a way, this reinforces this idea of strategy. Yes, it's a roadmap. It's a roadmap to do what? It's a roadmap to link our aspirations with our current capabilities. And how do we bridge the gap between current capabilities and where we want to get to? And again, that naturally is very, very challenging in a situation where the environment is changing around us, where we're faced with uncertainty. Final CEO that I think I'll quote again is Mr. Lafley, formerly the German CEO of P&G. He said the critical tasks of the CEO in strategic terms were defining and interpreting the meaningful outside. And what he meant by that is, what are the key issues in our competitive environment? What are key issues in our social, economic, technological environment that are relevant to us? Because once the CEO identifies some issues as being critically important, then it provides a hell of a focus for the rest of the organization to attend to those things. So having a clear definition and hopefully a correct interpretation of what's happening outside us by the CEO is vitally important. Answering time and again the twin questions of what business are we in and what business are we not in. And in a way, I would go one further than that and maybe add in a fifth one towards the end, which would be answering time and again the questions about how do we invest in flexibility and how do we invest in commitment? This notion, this balance between commitment, committing resources to certain assets or maintaining flexibility, that trade-off becomes important. The other trade-off that becomes important is how do we invest in the present while ensuring that we make necessary investments that will have future payoffs. So, the commitment of resources to ensure that, yes, we perform well in the short term, but also we're committing resources to ensure that we perform well in the longer term. And finally, from an organizational point of view, the message from the top. How does the CEO and the senior team shape the values and standards of the organization? And naturally, they shape the values and standards of the organization by their behavior, by how they behave, how they show up, how they display the values and standards of the organization. And of course, a vital issue around that is who do they promote? So who are they promoting? And are the people we're promoting displaying the values and standards of the organization? So again, I'd add in a fifth one there from my own perspective, and that is this notion of, balancing commitment into fixed resources and maintaining the ammunition or maintaining the gunpowder by remaining flexible. So that these to me are critical trade-offs, and these critical trade-offs are again made in the context of a rapidly changing environment. So when we talk about environment and we talk about uncertainty, just what are we talking about? And again, one of the key issues that I like to think about is just how do we think about uncertainty? And, this notion of uncertainty has been around for a long time. And in fact, a recent book has been written called Residual Uncertainty, which is written by a leading economist, John Kay, and the former governor of the Bank of England. It's a really good book that focuses in on uncertainty, and the way they talk about uncertainty is similar to the way I'm going to talk about uncertainty over the next couple of slides, and these slides are taken from a HBR article about uncertainty. And again, when we think about an uncertain environment, sometimes we look back and we think, oh my God, there's nothing we can do. The environment is so uncertain. We're paralyzed, and we can't think about what to do. And it's important to sort of conceptualize what we mean by uncertainty. And there are certain things that perhaps we know. There are certain parameters that we know that has a clear enough future. At national level, we know what the demographics look like. So in terms of healthcare and so on, We have a clear enough view of, let's say, the aging population. We have a clear enough view of pension requirements into the future. We have a clear enough view, perhaps, of healthcare or long-term care requirements in the future, driven by an aging population. So we can make certain predictions in a clear enough future about just the size, the demographics, the size of the elder population. And therefore we can, in a way, we can make a plan about that. Now, whether we choose to plan or not is another question, but we can do it. Alternative futures. Again, we can think about, situations where there are a number of discrete states of nature. And perhaps, an example of that might be, the US presidential election outcome. Even I'm glad to see there's three there, because suddenly we have potentially three candidates. We have the incumbent, we have the Democrat, and then we have a potential independent with Kanye. Now, naturally, we can look at these three alternatives and say, well, we can assign probabilities to them, and we can say, just on current polling, one might say that the Democratic candidate is the favorite. But we could actually think about, alternative futures and what's the state of nature that we're presented with. And we think about this sort of situation. One of the things we can begin to think about is thinking about contingency plans. So if Trump is re-elected, what might we do? If Democrats are elected to the presidency, what might we do? So, again, with situations where we're faced with discrete alternative futures, contingency planning is certainly an option to think about. And the last two, the sort of range of futures, and this again is, thinking about there's a whole range of potential states of nature in the future. We can't forecast it, but we know they're bound by maybe two parameters. Okay, so it's not an infinite range of futures. It's things we know that could exist. There's a range of them, and that range is bound by an upper bound and a lower bound. So, in many ways, we don't know quite yet, but we will know soon what the future relationship of Britain is going to be with the rest of Europe. And again, that may be sort of no relationship, totally third party, or it may be a much closer relationship, or a relatively close relationship. And we're not quite sure yet, although we can't say that it's veering in a certain direction. But we could identify a range of futures around which the future relationship with the UK, could occur. And finally, we have true ambiguity. And true ambiguity is totally different to the other types of uncertainty. If you look at the other types of uncertainty, clear enough future, alternative futures, a range of futures, those types of uncertainties are characterized by one thing, and that is, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, these are known unknowns. We know what we don't know. And when we know what we don't know, we can do a number of things. We can try to find out. We can try to invest in information. We can try to ask the experts. We can make assumptions because, okay, I don't know that, but I'll make an assumption. And so that's why assumptions and assumption testing is important. But these first three types of uncertainty, clear enough future, alternative futures, a range of futures, allow us to think through things because we know what we don't know. So we can invest in information or we can make assumptions. The issue with true ambiguity is, and in a way people might say that this is the sort of situation we're living in at the moment. The situation of true ambiguity is that we simply do not know what we don't know. So we can be surprised. Things can happen which we didn't anticipate. In a way, things can happen which we couldn't have anticipated. If you think back before March, even last Christmas, if somebody had said that we were going to be in a situation where in Ireland, where there's a lockdown situation because of a pandemic, I think people would have said that the likelihood of that is very, very slim. I'm not discounting the fact that Bill Gates and so on had predicted this. I'm not also discounting the fact that I think the number one issue in the risk register in the UK was potential pandemic. Nonetheless, I think for us, it was, this is a manifestation of a situation of, in a way, true ambiguity. 6 months ago, 8 months ago, I think we would never have envisaged such a situation arising in Ireland, or basically the country. is effectively locked down, and there's very little connectivity, and there's very little connectivity within the country. So how do you manage in this situation? Or, again, it's not so much, what are the companies that are likely to sort of, roll out of this situation? And again, in situations of true ambiguity, I think much of the advice would be, and it's easy to give advice, and it's much more difficult to execute it. And it's particularly easy to give advice in hindsight. But naturally, in situations of true ambiguity, I'll come back to commitment and flexibility. Flexibility, and particularly financial flexibility, is a very powerful asset to have in situations or environments of true ambiguity. I was looking at an interview with the CEO of the LATA over the weekend, and again, undoubtedly, short-term significant challenges. But what was interesting was he was talking about the financial flexibility that they had, and whether in fact there was an opportunity to grow the business further through acquisition because they had a certain level of financial flexibility and had access to financial resources. So the downside of that, of course, is that sometimes flexibility can be costly. And, if you want to remain flexible forever, then you won't make any investments. So this trade-off between commitment and flexibility becomes really critical. But nonetheless, what I want to stand back a little bit is to really think through, as we're thinking about our environment, as we're thinking about our aspiration for this company, for the company we work in, as we think about the capabilities that we have as a company, then closing that gap between current capability and future aspiration in the context of an uncertain environment forces us to think through just what types of uncertainties are we facing, and if we feel we're increasingly in a situation of true ambiguity, okay, how do we, if you like, prepare for that? What flexibility have we got in our operations? How adaptable are we? How financially flexible are we? Become really important questions. At the individual level, so we talked about the organization, and again, strategy being this process of adaptation in closing the gap between the aspirations of the company and our current capabilities in the context of a changing and uncertain environment. So that's if you like, the organizational level of analysis. We as managers, what are the things that we can do? And again, it's a reading I like a lot because it translates, if you like, the organizational level issues down to the managerial level issues, and what types of skills do we need to develop? What types of skills do we need not so much to develop, but what type of skills do we need to remind ourselves that we have and which we continue to need to hone? And again, this whole anticipatory skill, trying to figure out how the tectonic plates are shifting, naturally, engaging with customers, suppliers, being sensitive to how our customers' markets are changing, looking at fast-growing rivals and examining the actions that puzzle you. I always point this out, that they don't say copy them. They don't say look at fast-growing rivals and copy them. They say just examine actions that puzzle you. So think critically about why your rivals might be going faster than you, and think about their risk appetite, think about the risks they're taking, and think about, are they vulnerable in certain situations? List customers you've lost and figure out why. Very good practice to engage in. It can be difficult to sort of find out sometimes. It can be certainly difficult to hear the answers, but nonetheless, if strategy is about a competitive advantage, then we need to figure out how to gain a customer base. And if customers are leaving, we need to figure out why. Just expanding our antennae, attending conferences, events in other industries, maybe related industries to ours, but other industries which might give us a lead into how other industries are changing, the pressures in other industries, and thinking through, can we anticipate that those pressures will come to our industry? Challenge, I spoke about assumptions earlier, and challenge is all about assumption testing. It's about assumption surfacing, and it's about assumption testing. Think about the assumptions we've made about our business, And do they still hold true in the current environment, or will they hold true when we're through this current crisis? The way to do that is encouraging debate, encouraging a situation of psychological safety, where people can, if you like, challenge, where people can debate, where people can offer alternative views, not from an endless debating school point of view, but to reach conclusions and to reach the best conclusions we can come to. So this debate, this challenge is not an end in itself. It is to determine what the best course of action to pursue are. And one way to do that, these guys say, is create a roving position of devil's advocate. So in a way, try to make sure that devil's advocacy doesn't become the preserve of a single individual who rapidly can become identified as a crackpot. So it is to create this roving position of devil's advocate, where everyone in the management team knows that somebody will play this position, and that position is if like nominated, as opposed to the personal advocacy of one person. The reason this is important, the reason challenge is important, is because much of the data we face as senior managers is ambiguous. And we need to make sure we have the range of interpretations of those data. So if you're looking at ambiguous data, coming up with a number of interpretations of the data becomes important. And again, one of the sort of unfortunate human characteristics that we have is that we tend to actively look for data that confirms our hunches. And here we're saying, try to look for missing data or evidence that disconfirms our hunches. How could this go wrong? How am I interpreting this telling me something else? And again, this undoubtedly will take place in a group environment. And that's important because, again, through challenge and debate, we can enhance our interpretations. Deciding, okay, the fundamental raison d'etre to be an executive. What sets executives apart from everyone else is the responsibility to make decisions. Again, reframing binary decisions, go, no-go decisions, by asking what other options do we have. This is a creative process. And it's really important to think about sometimes what other options we have and to spend some time thinking about what other options we have. And the reason for that is, typically, in making a decision, one is making a choice. And in making a choice, it presupposes that you have alternatives to consider. And then we move to the next sort of axiom, that the best decision you make is a function of the quality of the alternatives you're considering. So if you're considering better alternatives, then the likelihood of making better decisions is enhanced. So thinking through what other options do we have, what other alternatives do we have, becomes really important. Naturally, engagement, determining who needs to be involved, who can influence the success of your decision, engaging with people can become really important to facilitate execution later on, but not only to facilitate execution, it also, to go back to the previous points, getting the right people around the table enables us to challenge and interpret, so that it can also enhance the quality of our decision, as well as the efficacy of its execution. Communicating early and often to avoid no one told me, no one asked me. So again, getting engagement, getting alignment to help to facilitate execution, reaching out resistors directly to understand their concerns. And this sometimes raises questions among colleagues when they discuss it with them, because again, we tend to sometimes avoid resistors. But the critical thing here is the resistors, first of all, will have a different point of view. So it may be worthwhile to listen to them, to engage with them. And secondly, ultimately, we want to bring people with us. So the resistors, if they can be engaged directly, sometimes we can easily accommodate the reason they're resisting, but we need to know why they're resisting. And let's not make an assumption about why people are resisting. Let's engage with them, find out why they're resisting, and then try to, I'm not saying accommodate their resistance, but to deal directly with it and to perhaps move on. And then learning. To me, the critical thing, the critical skill in all of this, particularly in managing in turbulent times, is to learn. So if we're faced with a situation like this again, what have we learned through this crisis? And I know we're still in perhaps in the middle of it. Hopefully a vaccine is found soon, and we hopefully get through it in the not too distant future. But nonetheless, the expectation is there will be other events. There may be, or there could be other events which require, if you like, a crisis response. What have we learned in our organizations? What have we learned as a nation about our crisis response capability? So instituting after action reviews, thinking through the 4 simple questions that the US Army use after every action. And that is, what was supposed to happen? What actually happened? Why is there a difference? And what do we do differently next time? Again, the 4 questions are, what was supposed to happen? What actually happened? Contrasting those 2 questions helps us establish the facts. Why was there a difference? And what do we do differently next time? They're in the realm of shared opinion. So naturally there are opinions about why there's a difference and opinions about what we do next. But it's vitally important to establish the facts, what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, and then to think about and consider, what do we do, what do we learn, what do we do next? So to me, these are the really critical individual skills that we need to always have at the front of our heads and think about, how are we doing this? How are we doing these better? Can we improve our anticipation? Can we certainly improve the challenging environment that we have without creating interpersonal conflict? How can we enhance our interpretations of ambiguous data? How do we decide? How do we align? And how do we learn? So, getting towards the end. Strategy is about managing this tension between the aspiration of the organization and our current capabilities. And the challenge, of course, is managing that gap, or closing that gap in an uncertain, ambiguous environment. So why do we need it? We need it because the world is changing. We need to have these debates about what it is we want to achieve, what are our capabilities, and how do we navigate the distance between our aspiration and our capabilities. Customer expectations are changing, competitors are becoming more keen. We have limited resources, so we must decide, we must make choices, and we must make choices between what will deliver success in the short term versus what will deliver success in the long term. And we also need to think about, to what extent do we manage our resources and we commit, let's say, to extensive fixed assets, to extensive commitments, versus to what extent do we keep our resources relatively flexible in cash or other fairly flexible, accessible sources of finance. Again, these are really critical decisions, and naturally, owner expectations. So we need to basically engage with strategy to deliver owner expectations of sometimes higher returns. What is the purpose of strategy? Making the best choices that we possibly can and creating this clarity of focus that Bob Iger talked about earlier. This clarity of focus which facilitates, the commitment of resources to the right priorities. So this clarity of focus becomes important. The questions that strategy must answer: what is our aim? What is our aspiration? And are we clear about that? Where are we competing? How will we win? The 2 sort of yin and yang questions, if you like. Just where are we competing? What geographies? What product markets? What segments? And how will we win in those product markets, geographies, segments? What sets us apart? What's our unique selling proposition? What's the source of our competitive advantage? And if we know what our aim is, and we know where we are, how do we get from where we are to where we want to get to, given the capabilities that we have? So what new capabilities must we develop? How do we enhance our existing capabilities? Again, this tension between what's our aim and where are we now, and managing that tension in the face of an uncertain environment becomes really important. And ultimately, if we're successful, and there's no guarantee of success, we live in a risky, uncertain environment. So nothing here I can tell you can guarantee you success, but maybe we can enhance the odds of success. But the measure of success are two things. And again, we need to focus on both. How do we enhance and deliver greater value for our customers so that we win in the marketplace, thereby yielding greater profitability? So these are the, if you like, the key points that I'd like to leave you with. Last two slides before we get into questions. You know, one of the things we have a diploma in strategy development and innovation. And again, the purpose of our program is to learn key concepts and frameworks to understand how to develop business over the long term. It's one thing to deliver the concepts, it's another thing to practice them. And you know, there's an extensive case discussion and casework throughout our diploma. And the reason we use cases is to provide an arena to practice discussion, to practice debate, to practice the challenging of each other's assumptions, and to learn from each other actually, because a lot of the learning comes from the different perspectives from different industries around the table. And again, that enhances our anticipation skills, the skills I spoke about earlier. And ultimately, okay, how to transfer it to make an impact. How do we use the knowledge and skills to make good strategy in practice? Okay, strategy is an important topic, as we saw from the first quote from the book I saw, the most important change made in the intellectual landscape of business over the past 50 years. And it's really important because it potentially makes a difference if we're better at making strategy, if we execute strategies better, if we develop better strategies. It should yield, I can't guarantee it, but it should yield better results. The types of subjects that we look at, so there's a certain sequence to them. We start off with a strategic leadership, which is basically the basic building blocks of developing strategy. Then a colleague talks about strategy in a turbulent environment explicitly. Then we move on to what do we mean by market position and what do we mean by competitive advantage. Many of us, and one of the key commendations I have is that strategy is made by a top management team and then it's endorsed or challenged by a board. So what do we know about top management team dynamics? And what do we know about decision making? How do we make better decisions? Then we move into business model innovation. So thinking about what are the challenges, what are some techniques to enable us to sort of innovate our business models. And naturally then we need to think about execution. And the final module is about leading innovation and change. So that's our diploma in strategy development and innovation. It commenced in November. And I'll ask Caroline then to maybe pop in and consider if we had any questions. I'm just ahead of time, 37 minutes. I thought it was going to be about 40.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Pat.
That was great.
That was great.
You actually have a lot of questions. I'm just going to pull them up here now. So Peter,
Yeah, sure.
who is an alum of two programs, I know he's on the MSc pathway, he says, we keep hearing of 3- and 5-year plans. In the current environment, what is realistic? What is a realistic time frame for strategy and planning for SC?
Yeah. Okay, so I think I'd go back to my quote, and that is no plan survives contact with the enemy. So we can have a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan, and it's worth considering what might happen, the actions we might take over the next 3 to 5 years. And that's a good discipline to engage in because it forces the management team to begin to think about what are our aspirations, what are our current capabilities, and what are some of the key moves we might want to make between then and now to achieve our aspiration. However, and this is the big however, what we've written down in the plan, I'd be confident will not get executed as we anticipated because the world will change around us in unanticipated ways. So strategy then is the ongoing process of managing this tension between our aspiration and our capabilities. Part of managing that tension requires us perhaps to sit down and think through how we see the world evolving, what our aspirations are, and where our current capabilities are. But we must leaven that weekend away, or that 3 weeks, or that 4 weeks, or that 6 months in developing the strategy. We must be humble. We have to be humble in the face of an environment that is in many ways uncertain and risky. And therefore, by all means, spend the time developing the plan, the strategy, but keep it under constant review because the world changes around us.
Okay. We have a question here from David. He's an alum of our team coaching diploma. He asks, Pat, in a highly complex and uncertain world, is it still reasonable to think the CEO is the one that can define the meaning outside and provide clarity to the rest of the organization? To what extent is the role of the CEO to enable direction and clarity without needing to define it him or herself?
Sure. I think great question, and I totally agree, David. In a way, what we could say is that the top management team needs to be directly involved. It is a complex and uncertain environment. One of the things I said was we need to develop a culture of psychological safety, particularly at executive level. And the reason one needs to do that is we need to get as much information, as much challenge around the top management team table as possible. All I would say is that ultimately the CEO is responsible for the strategy and performance of the organization. So he or she, once they make a pronouncement that these are the issues that we've considered, even if the top management team has considered them, once the CEO says, these are the issues that we've considered, and these are the critical strategic issues that we face, and this is what we must address. Once that statement is made, it provides an unbelievable focus for the rest of the organization to focus around those issues. So I agree with you. What's really important is that we seek to try to identify the really important issues, and we seek to try and get those issues right. And one way to do that is to engage the senior management because there's a broader set of antennae there, but we need to engage them in a meaningful way to come up with a common understanding of how is the environment changing around us, what are the critical strategic issues we need to face. And once we've done that, the CEO will say, these are the issues. And all I'm saying is once that happens, it provides a very powerful direction for the organization. One, hopefully that is correct. But I agree with you. The process of getting to that conclusion, if you like, should be engaging. And it should be engaging because the world is complex, as you say. And so we need to engage the right people around that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Michal Sheridan. Michal was on our MSc pathway, which is great. I think he graduated last year. Following on from the question about the benefit of agility and strategy, what is the best response for businesses in black swan situations like COVID-19? What would you do first thing when a black swan event happens?
Yeah, great question. I suppose the things I'd be thinking about when a black swan event happens is, first of all, I revisit the assumptions that are underpinning my strategy, and I begin to think about which of those assumptions are really challenged. Sorry, I won't even say challenged. Which of those assumptions are wrong? Okay, which of them are right and which of them are wrong, and therefore, if it's a preponderance of ones which are wrong, then we need to begin to think about how do we navigate through the situation that's confronting us. What are the new capabilities we need to develop? Have we got the financial resources to be flexible? What degrees of freedom do we have to act nimbly and with agility and so on? These nice words that we use. I don't want to be glib. It's easy to say to be agile. It's easy to say to be flexible. They are investments. Okay, it means holding things in reserve, and that's a major trade-off. That's a major trade-off question that we face on an ongoing basis. Where do we commit resources? To what extent do we keep resources flexible? And I think increasingly, what we're seeing through the crisis is that there will be, oddly enough, an increased emphasis on flexibility, which will be counter to a traditional emphasis on efficiency. When we think about supply chains and so on, we're thinking about how do we have the most efficient supply chain possible? How do we wring out slack out of the system? I think one lesson from the crisis is that when you have an incredibly lean supply chain, okay, you may be at risk. And so suddenly people are saying, oh, suddenly we need multiple sources of supply, let's say, for critical inputs. And that's a lesson learned in this crisis. But there's a trade-off there. Once one invests in potentially multiple sources of supply, then one may be losing efficiency. So this is what I mean by these trade-offs. It can be very easy for people to say, invest in agility, invest in flexibility, but that is a trade-off against traditional notions of efficiency. So, what would I do first, to go back to Mihal's question? I think I'd do first is think about, it's not the assumptions that are written down on the page that underpins our strategy, it's the mental assumptions we made about the behavior of our competitors, the behavior of our suppliers, the behavior of our customers. What assumptions have we made that are wrong? I'm recently working with a food service company that supplies into cafes, restaurants, and so on. And they've had to have a major rethink, if you like, of their approach, their distribution approach, the types of customers they have, because simply the demand for food service type products has decreased a lot. So again, thinking through what assumptions underpin their strategy, which assumptions are true, which assumptions are not true, and how do we rethink, let's say, distribution channels, how do we rethink customer bases and so on, becomes really important. Sorry, Caroline.
No, that's great. I'm just looking at the questions that are coming through. We have a question actually from Pat, who is another alum of our program, which is great that we're joined by so many of our alumni. Any recommendations for lightweight strategy management stroke execution tools you would recommend for an SME?
Sure. Okay. So I think I'd answer, although I can't get in my head whether there are 6 or 7 questions, but I think one of the first question I'd always begin to ask is, what are we trying to achieve? What's the aspiration? Next question then I'd ask myself is just, where are we playing? What choices am I making in terms of products, markets, value chain stage, distribution channels? What's my USP? What's the source of my advantage? That's the next 2 questions. Then the next question after that is, so what capabilities do I currently have, and what capabilities do I need to compete in the product markets and geographies that I'm thinking of competing in? And then what are the key, in order to, if I think about those organizational capabilities, what are the key execution levers that I have, even in SME, incentive systems, structure, what culture am I creating? Those sort of, to me, what people am I selecting? When I have the people in, what culture am I creating? How am I incentivizing them? And I got them organized in the right way? Those sort of 4 questions are simple ways to think about execution. But I think if you have clear answers to those, you're a long way of the way. And then the final thing is, what metrics am I using to monitor success? And those metrics will be driven by, ultimately, what am I trying to achieve? What's my aspiration? How important is profitability? How important is market share growth? How important are some of these parameters? And so tracking those parameters then becomes important. So again, what's the aspiration? Where am I playing? What's my advantage, and what's my unique selling proposition? What capabilities do I have, and what capabilities do I need to develop? And then how do I execute? And execution really is about, have I got the right people? Have I got them organized the right way? Have I got them incentivized the right way? And what culture am I trying to create with those people?
Okay. I think we'll take 2 more, and what we might do, Pat, is I might collate these when we're sending out the recording, and we might come back to some of the questions we didn't get to.
Sure.
So there's a question, I have a question from Tom, and then I have a question, Thomas, and a question from Laura. So Thomas's question is a well...
Can they be easier than the previous questions though, Caroline? I hope they're easier than the previous questions.
Well, I think Thomas's question is a well-run company one that is better able to exploit disruptive forces, or is being well-run a telltale sign that conventional thinking is at play and management are actually not so well prepared to respond to disruptive forces and should adopt creative disruption thinking to navigate through this crisis?
Okay, so you didn't obey my instructions. And I think whether we think about disruption, I have a certain view of disruption, but let's park that for a moment. I think the critical question that a strategy has to answer is, what's the source of our advantage? And what's our unique selling proposition to our customers? And those two questions are related to each other. And we can arrive at it through some sort of disruptive technology, through some disruptive framework, but ultimately, we have to establish how we're competing in a superior fashion to our competitors in the marketplace. So how are we offering more value to our customers, and how are we achieving greater profitability than our competitors? Now, how one comes at that is, there's a myriad of ways one can come at that. But to me, the critical question is, just what is the source of advantage? How sustainable is that? And that source of advantage has to be meaningful in the marketplace to our customers, and ultimately has to deliver some level of let's say certainly for a publicly listed company, some level of superior return.
Okay. I will obey the...
No.
I'm joking. The last question, actually, it's great because I think everybody interest is piqued with the references you made in the webinar. So Laura, who's an exec MBA alum of 2008, asks, can you recommend some reading, books or articles from members of the management team that have very little knowledge of strategy? But I think off the back of that, maybe we could also send a note out.
We can.
Relate to some of your reading and some of your articles of interest that we can send out.
Yeah. So there's one article in particular that I use in the program, and it's public access, so we can send that out. The title of the paper is really simple. Are you sure you have a strategy? And it really, I think, nails this, what is frequently a very ephemeral, very abstract notion of what strategy is. I'm sure many of you, when you hear the word strategy, you sort of put your head in your hands and say, oh my God, let's not have another rigmarole that's totally meaningless, of this endless discussion and debate that really ends up nowhere. And so I'm not saying this reading will eliminate those feelings, but it certainly is a reading that I share with executive teams when I'm working with them to help them crystallize and think through what do we mean by strategy, and what are the critical questions that we need to answer to be confident that we have a strategy, that strategy has been debated well, and that we have a common view among the senior management team of what we're trying to do. And this, to me, is really critical, that it is the senior management team that needs to make sure that there is a common view of what the strategy is, because once that's clear, then we begin to prioritize in a coordinated manner, and we begin to allocate resources in a coordinated manner.
Okay. Well, that's great. I think we can wrap up the questions at this point, and to thank everybody that has stayed on the line with us this morning.
Really appreciate it.
Really great, and great to see so many of our UCD alumni across all disciplines. Pat referenced our November intake of the Diploma in Strategy, Development and Innovation. There are very limited places remaining, also due to the fact that we have to reduce our class sizes for safety reasons. We would ask anybody that is thinking about taking on a program this autumn to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. I'll send out details of how to get in touch with a copy of this recording and a copy of the articles that Pat referenced and some of the books also. So thank you once again, Pat, from myself and all the team behind the scenes.
Thank everyone for staying on and asking such great questions. I really appreciate it. And again, great to hear from so many of our alumni on the questions. Delighted to hear from them.
Brilliant.
And best wishes to anyone who's thinking of doing the program. And if you have questions about the program that you need to talk to me about, Caroline will direct you to me. Absolutely.
Okay. So we'll conclude the webinar, and we shall share details of the next webinar in the series with our colleague Colin Murphy on coaching and culture, and that's coming next month in early August. So we hope you have a good day, and we'll look forward to keeping in touch with you. Thank you.
Yes. Bye-bye.